Elijah had some high moments in his life, but he also had some low ones. Over the past couple of weeks, we've seen how God has sent a drought in the land because he's just kind of not happy with his people, the Israelites. It's kind of one of those, another one of those ways that God is choosing to punish them. Elijah had been living out in the desert where there was a river, where there was drinking water. God had sent nasty birds, ravens, to provide him with food. And so God is taking care of him while he's there. Eventually the river dries up and God instructs Elijah to go to the home of a widow in a town called Zarephath. And when he sees this widow, he asks for some water and some food. And she says that she only has a small amount of flour and oil. And she's collecting sticks so that she can cook one last meal for her and her son. Things are grim. But Elijah assures her that God will not allow her food to diminish until the rain returns. And we see the widow put her trust in Elijah, and her food lasted for her until it rained again, about 3 years. In a couple of weeks, we're going to see one of Elijah's lowest moments where he runs in fear of his life because of an evil queen. Elijah has some highs, he has some lows, and again, over the last few weeks, we've looked at this verse out of James chapter 5. It says, Elijah was a man just like us. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. He was a normal, ordinary guy who God used to do extraordinary things. We find the story of Elijah in the books of 1 Kings and the beginning of 2 Kings, and what we've learned most from Elijah is that he had an extraordinary trust in God. In a period of time where it seemed like finding someone obedient to God was scarce, Elijah held firm. And while there's things that just kind of seemed crazy at the time, he was trusting nonetheless. And we find that when we learn to trust in God, obedience comes a little bit easier. Also during this time, King Ahab is king in Israel, and he was just not a good king. 1 Kings 16:33 says, Ahab did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the other kings of Israel before him. He was a bad dude. And to make matters worse, he married a woman named Jezebel, which was like the most famous name of, all girls in 900 BC, but never again. But she was from another nation, and God had told the Israelites specifically, don't marry these people or they're going to lead your hearts away from me and worship other gods. But because of the marriage, Ahab started worshiping the gods of Baal and Asherah, further pulling himself and the Israelite people away from the one true God. And things were so bad that Jezebel had been killing off God's prophets. And Elijah had kind of had enough, and he was about to confront King Ahab with one of the most amazing moments in the Bible. We pick up in 1 Kings 18, verses 16 through 19. It says, Ahab went to meet Elijah. And when he saw Elijah, he said to them, is that you troubler of Israel? He says, well, I've not made trouble for Israel, Elijah replied, but you and your family have. You abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel and meet me on Mount Carmel. And bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Have you ever had to have a difficult conversation with somebody? Bring up truth that maybe wasn't popular but something they needed to hear? Because having difficult conversations is rough, and it's not something that I personally have mastered, but I feel like I'm growing and I'm getting better at it, I think. But here we see Elijah telling Ahab something difficult. You are the reason why things are the way that they are. You are the reason of the problems in Israel, that you have abandoned God's commands. You have followed false gods. And so he's pointing that out on the front side, and then he sets the stage for this showdown to remember. Verse 20 says, so Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. Have you ever wavered between two things, two decisions? About 6 years ago, my wife and I, we lived in Oregon. We had 2 kids at the time. We had a third on the way. we had 2 cars, and neither of them were going to be able to fit 3 kids with car seats comfortably, let alone safely. But we started looking at cars, and I said, we got to get an SUV because that's, more mannish. And if we're going to have 1 car, let's bulk up. She really wanted a minivan, and I wasn't ready to give away my man card at that point. But if you have a minivan, that's perfectly fine. But I did not want one at that time. And so in this decision, again, we were going to have to give up both of our cars in order to have one, and so I really wanted something that I would enjoy driving. And so we went back and forth for weeks trying to figure out, here's the pros, here's the cons, after weeks of going back and forth and telling my wife how it was going to be and telling her that it just wasn't going to happen, we were going to get a minivan, we went to the dealership, took our cars, and drove off the lot that day with a minivan. Because sometimes when we waver, it's difficult. But I think if we're honest, we waver on more things than we'd like to admit sometimes. But this is that position kind of that Elijah finds himself. He confronts God's people and he says, how long will you waver between 2 opinions? The Israelites have been playing this back and forth game with God, and Elijah finally calls them out on it. He says, you've got to make a choice. It's either God or it's Baal. It's kind of like the story of Joshua back in Joshua 24 when he also said something similar to the Israelites. It says, choose this day who you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And it's really a question for us too, right? That are we going to be all in or are we going to be all out? Because God doesn't want our half-hearted devotion. He wants all or nothing. He wants our trust. He wants our obedience. The prophet Samuel said, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. Jesus asked the question in Luke chapter 6, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? Jesus also said in John 14:23, anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. My Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. Maybe for someone here today, you're not sure about faith and trusting in Jesus with your life. You're not really sure if you want to be in or out, because it's a lot to take in. But the question to you is, how long are you going to waver? Because God ultimately calls us to make a choice. Again, Joshua called the Israelites to make a choice, and now we have Elijah calling the Israelites to make a choice. Jesus calls us to make a choice. But the reality is that even though there's a choice, God's patient. And hopefully that's comforting and good news to you. 2 Peter 3:9 says, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. Now here at Northeast, please know that we're not going to try and strong arm you into making some decision for Jesus, and if you don't, then we're going to slash your tires. We're not going to do things like that. We hope that this is a place where you can feel safe, and you can take your time as you learn about God and search for yourself. And we want to be here to help answer any questions that you may have to get you to a point where you feel like you can make a decision for the right reason. But when it comes to God, we do have a choice to make. And so what side of the fence are you on? Because in the end, it comes down to obedience of what God calls us to, and it doesn't always make sense. But we learn to pursue and trust God because his ways are higher and better than our own. And again, we may think that the situation between the Israelites and us is a little bit different because, for them they worship false gods and they had idols, and maybe it's just a reminder, but most of us don't probably worship physical idols. But if left unchecked, other things can take on the form of idols in our lives, that we can use and pursue them in place of what God has for us, and only what God can give us. So do you pursue things in your own life that may You hope that they'll bring happiness, hoping that they'll bring some sort of satisfaction. Maybe it's a relationship, or it's money, or it's fitting in, or being a part of something, or getting a job, or getting good grades, or maybe even food. Adventure, sports, status, success, being busy. What is it that you tend to pursue? Because a lot of times we pursue things that overpromise and underdeliver. And it's those things that always leave us wanting more. And so are you going to waver between following the things of this world or trusting in what God has to give you all that you need? And again, this is the choice that Elijah brings before the people. He's saying, stop going back and forth between things. Stop limping through life half-heartedly and make a choice. Stop wavering. And so Elijah calls the people out, and he calls the prophets of Baal and Asherah out for a barbecue. Verse 22, then Elijah said to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but set no fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. Then all the people said, what you say is good. And Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Again, Elijah starts this contest by saying, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left. Anybody know what it's like to be left by yourself? Ever been picked last for the team? Maybe seeing all of your friends on social media doing something fun and you didn't even get an invite. Or maybe sometimes being the only one around to stand up for your beliefs. We were created to be in community. And here's something to think about. We were never meant to do life alone, but sometimes you have to believe by yourself. Let me say that again. We were never meant to do life alone, but sometimes you may have to believe by yourself. And are you okay with that? Are you okay being the only one at the office who watches what you say? Are you okay being the only one at your family Christmas party who's not drinking? Are you okay being the only one in the gym who's honoring your spouse with your eyes? Are you okay being the only one? And I think here we see Elijah saying, I'm okay with that because God's called me to live a life like this. God called me to be uniquely different. I'm okay being alone. I'm okay believing by myself. Because true obedience looks like confidence when you stand alone. When I stand alone, I show where my obedience is at. When I'm alone, I show where I have aligned myself, what I believe in and what I support. And so Elijah is facing 450 prophets of Baal alone. And he has trust and confidence that God will show up. He has trusted in what God has done before, and he trusts that he will do it again. We sang that truth in the song earlier. The same God who never fails will not fail me now. And in the waiting, the same God who's never late is working all things out. And that's the kind of trust that Elijah has in God's promises, and he offers this challenge. Let's see whose God is real and whose is not. And just to give you a little bit of additional thoughts for this event and where it's taken place, Mount Carmel was thought to be the dwelling place of the god Baal. And so the prophets and Ahab were probably thinking, hey, this is going to be a great advantage. This is like our mountain. And of course, it's 450 to 1. And then Elijah lets them choose their bull first, so that way they can't, complain, well, it just wasn't fit for the sacrifice. So they picked the one that they wanted. However, Baal is also supposedly the god of rain. And if you remember, it hadn't rained in 3 years. Coincidence? And we're thinking probably that was embarrassing to the prophets of Baal. Like, hey, our God's supposed to be the God of rain, and it's not raining. And so they've got something else to prove. And it's just kind of interesting to note a few things that kind of seem to be in their advantage going into this contest. But then it starts to get good. Verse 26, then they, the prophets of Baal, called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. And I always thought that was funny as a kid, that he was taunting them, because, you know, when you're a kid, you're told not to taunt people, right? But this is one of God's prophets, so kind of interesting. But anyways, he begins to taunt them at noon. I guess about 3 hours have passed since this moment, so he says, shout louder. Surely he is a god. Note the sarcasm. Perhaps he's in deep thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice, but there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. And so this contest begins, and Baal's prophets gets things going. It says they called to Baal for about 3 hours, and there was no response. No one answered. Why? Because false gods never respond how we need them to. And so after about 3 hours, Elijah starts to taunt them. And again, for me, I enjoy sarcasm, and a lot of times it gets me in trouble, but this is just too good. He says, hey, shout louder, surely he's a god. Maybe he's lost in thought somewhere. Maybe he's busy, which literally translated means he's relieving himself. Maybe he's on a cruise in the Bahamas or mountain biking. Or maybe he's asleep. So he uses these moments to taunt these prophets. I want to tell you a story about Eric. When I was in 7th grade, I was not the fine muscular specimen that you see before you today. I was a 4'10", like 120 pounds, soaking wet shrimp boat. And I wanted to play football, because if there's ever anything you want to do is, play football when you're tiny. But that was me. I'm pretty sure the pads were bigger than I was, but I remember going out for football and being probably one of the smallest, if not the smallest guy on the team, being surrounded by lots of bigger guys. And I remember I had my friend Eric. Every single day he was just kind of like, dude, why are you here? Like you don't fit. Like you're never going to tackle anybody. You're really not going to be a big benefit. You're tiny, you're weak. But then the day came where we had our first, full pad, full contact practice, and I was like, all right, man, this is it. And so when we got up to the tackling drill, who were the first two up? Me and Eric. And, Eric's he's not a small dude. He's, probably got a foot on me. He's probably about 75 pounds more. He's big. But, all this energy, I'm ready to get after it. And so we set up the drill. They toss him the ball. He comes after me, tries the old stiff arm thing, and I leveled him. It was awesome. And so word to the wise, if you want to taunt and trash talk, you better be able to back it up. But please know this, I'm not advocating for taunting or trash talk, but hopefully you get the point. Taunting is something that's not always favorable, but sometimes necessary. The prophets of Baal in this moment were probably a little bit upset, as some people would be. But the crazy thing is that it's like it hit them and they listened to it because they started shouting louder. And it says they even started slashing themselves with swords and spears. That's not like, hey, oops, I scratched myself. It's like, no, here's my sword and cut yourself. So they're really hoping that this is going to be the moment. And again, they're going so over the top. And it says that they did this for another 3 hours with, again, no response. Why? Because false gods never respond how we need them to. Verse 30. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." And so again, you have this scene where all the prophets of Baal are exhausted and they're bleeding from their failed attempt to summon their God. And Elijah calls the people to himself. And he repairs this altar that had been previously torn down. It says he takes 12 stones from the tribes of Israel, who were the sons of Jacob, part of their heritage. And I think sometimes we can read through the story and we think like, okay, great, he builds an altar because that's what the other guys did. But it's interesting that he takes 12 stones for the 12 tribes of Israel to try and help these people to remember where they came from. To help them remember that they have a history. It's like a family who has a lot of traditions, or a mom that scrapbooks everything to make sure that you never forget where you came from. And never forget who your family is. Because at this point, Israel had been completely ripped apart. And Elijah was trying to help them remember what they had lost. So he rebuilds this altar with 12 stones for the 12 tribes so that people can remember where they came from. He wants them to understand that even though the 12 tribes have been divided into 2 nations, they are still one people with one God, with one covenant, with one destiny. And what does this have to do with us? As Christians, this is part of our history as well. Did you know that Christianity is the only religion that is is inclusive of all people groups? It was God's design. Paul talked about it in Galatians 3. He says, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." And Paul said again in Ephesians chapter 4, "There is one body and one spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism. One God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all." That you are part of something huge. Old, young, rich, poor, tall, short, male, female. You have a place where God wants to meet you in Jesus. Verse 32. With the stones, Elijah built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bowl into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water, and pour it on the offering on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered. And they did it the 3rd time. And the water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. So Elijah prepares his sacrifice. He digs a trench and he has water poured over the sacrifice 3 separate times. Now remember, it's been 3 years since it's rained. They're in a drought. And so the most precious commodity that they have is now being wasted in the eyes of the people. So people would probably be mad about this. And you got to think of the time that it took to get the water and to pour it and, hey, go do it again. And let's do it again is going to add to the anticipation of what this moment was going to look like. Because fire consuming a sacrifice out of thin air would be miraculous to begin with, right? But then to cover it in water, that just makes it impossible. But in this moment, we see Elijah's trust is extraordinary. But what about you and me? Is our trust extraordinary, or is it often conditional? God, if you do this for me, then I'll trust you. God, if you give me that job or that promotion, then I'll trust you. If you give me that raise or give me that guy or that girl, that house, God, then I'll trust you. But what about when the bottom falls out? Will you continue to trust that God's in control and that God's going to show up and that things are going to work out? And I don't know about you, but I've had many times in my life where I have struggled to trust in God's provision. I've struggled to trust and allow God to just lead my life through the good and through the bad. And my family and I have moved quite a bit over the years. And it's been a struggle every time we've done that to trust that God's going to provide for us and for our needs. But time and time again, I've seen him come through. But can I let you off the hook a little bit this morning? I know sometimes we get this thought in our mind, well, it's God. Like I can't question these things. But it's okay. It's okay to have seasons of your life where you don't know what it means or what it looks like to trust God. It's okay not to be sure what comes next or how God is working and moving in your life. It's okay to have questions because the truth is your understanding of who God is doesn't change who God is. Let me say that again. Your understanding of who God is doesn't change who God is. Because even as a pastor, I don't have all the answers, and we're never going to have all the answers, and we may be confused and even angry. But know that God will be who he is regardless, because he's promised over and over to be with you in the midst of anything that life may throw at you. He's a God that loves you more than you could ever begin to know or to understand. He loved you so much he sent Jesus to pay the penalty of sin on the cross, so that you and I can have a relationship with him. And he calls you to trust him and to be obedient, even in the times where it doesn't make sense. Even in the times where maybe the odds are stacked against you. Back to the story, verse 36, at the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and he prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And so when the time comes, without any theatrics or some big show, he simply prays as one person would talk to another. He says, God, I'm here as your servant, and I'm obedient to your commands. And Elijah prays not for himself, but for the people. He prays that God will bring his people back to himself, his people who have wavered for so long, not trusting in God, that his people, that he is patient towards, his people that he never gives up on. And that's the message for us today too. That we have a God who remains faithful to us even when we are unfaithful to him. We have a God who loves us and cares for us and accepts us as we are even when we may not feel his presence. But we see Elijah in this moment holding firm in his faith and was an obedient servant, which really is what's needed if we want God to show up and answer us. So the question is, how do you stand firm before the fire falls? Verse 38, then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. And when all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. Where do you stand in your trust with God? Because if you say that you trust him, then your obedience should be a natural response. And I think the difficulty is this, that life's not easy. And it's easy to kind of waver back and forth. It's because life's not that simple. Jesus said in John 16:33, in this world you will have trouble. But the thing I love about this verse is it doesn't stop there. Because that would be horrible. In this world, you're going to have trouble. The end. See you later. He says, no, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. In Jesus, we have a living hope that surpasses anything this world has to offer. He will always come through for us, but we have to choose to trust and be obedient. And I'm not sure what your story is. I'm not sure what your situation looks like. I don't know when or where or how God is going to show up for you. And maybe you've seen God show up in somebody else's life and do amazing things in somebody else, and you're just like, man, when's it going to happen for me? And I think the difficulty comes when we wait for God, but we're unwilling to be obedient to what He's called us to. Like I said, it's easy to waver between God and something else. It's easy to get off track or to straddle the line. It's easy for us to lose sight of God's goodness when difficult situations arise in your life. But don't forget, He's with you. He's promised again and again to be with you, to never leave you or forsake you, but we have to be willing to stand firm in our faith. We have to be willing to be obedient to His word, to trust Him with everything that we are. And I believe when we do, that's when we'll see God move. Here's the takeaway this morning. Where do you need to be more obedient? Is it in your family? In your job? Your finances? Your time? School? Your own personal life? Are you expecting a move of God before showing obedience to Him? And while sometimes that's hard, it comes with trusting in Him. It comes when we're obedient to Him. It comes when we choose to put God first in our lives. When we're not wavering between God and money, and God and a relationship, between God and a job, and God and friendships, God and popularity. We trust and we're obedient, and God will provide. God will show up. Because God is continually pursuing you. He's continually pursuing me, and that's good news. And if we choose Him and trust Him and obey Him, He will always come through for us. It says in Romans chapter 8, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. And so how do you stand firm before the fire falls? You put your trust in the one who stopped at nothing for you, who loved you so much that He sent His Son Jesus to die on a cross so that you and I can have a right, restored relationship with Him. To be forgiven, to be free, and to live the life that He created us to live. And the best part is that when we get that and we understand that, we put our trust in Him, it's not a burden. It's not just like, man, I got to live there's all these rules and I got to follow all these things. I don't have to live a life for Jesus. It's I get to. I get to. Man, what a privilege because of what He's done. How can I not? I get to trust. I get to obey because of what He's done for me. And so this morning, if you've never made a decision for Jesus, made that decision to make Him Lord of your life, maybe today is that day. To say, God, I don't have all the answers. I just don't know. But I want to trust in You, and I want to allow You to work and to move in my life and be obedient to what You've called me to. And maybe for some of you in the room, maybe you've made that decision, but maybe you've gotten off track. Because it's easy to waver between two things. And yeah, you trust in God, but maybe not completely. And you need to come back home. To hear that God is pursuing you and turning your heart back again. Because we look at the story of Elijah and we think, man, I'm not Elijah. But Elijah was a normal guy. And what God did in Elijah's life, He can do in yours. He was an ordinary man who did extraordinary things, but only with the trust in God that led to obedience. You and I are ordinary people who can do extraordinary things if we learn to do the same. Let's pray.